Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today's webinar. My name is Sarah Sako. I am a Deputy Director at the National Center on Improving Literacy. I want to welcome you to today's webinar. Our Reading the Room series centers on discussions with researchers, practitioners, and community members on the science of reading, evidence-based literacy instruction, and related policies that affect students and teachers. We're pleased to share this 7th event with you focused on sustaining your multi-tiered systems of support for reading, or MTSS-R. Today, panelists will share their perspectives on building a system of sustainability, barriers or obstacles to sustainability, and strategies for success. This event will be recorded and posted to the NCIL website. We ask that you please use the Q&A option to post your questions, and we will take some questions at the end as time permits. At this time, I want to provide you with a brief overview of NCIL. So the National Center on Improving Literacy is a federally funded national comprehensive center established by the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, in the fall of 2016. It is jointly administered by the Office of Special Education Programs and the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education at the U.S. Department of Education. We are a partnership among literacy experts, university researchers, and technical assistance providers from these organizations under the direction of Boston University Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. Our mission is to increase access to and use of evidence-based approaches to screen, identify, and teach pre-K to grade 12 students with dyslexia and other literacy-related disabilities. Our 5 priorities are to identify or develop free or low-cost evidence-based assessment tools for identifying students at risk of not attaining full literacy skills due to a disability, identify evidence-based literacy instruction, strategies, and accommodations designed to meet the specific needs of such students, provide families of these students with information to assist their child, identify or develop evidence-based professional development for practitioners, and provide technical assistance to stakeholders. And finally, disseminate our products to regionally diverse entities. At this time, I'd like to introduce you to our moderator for today's discussion, Dr. Lena Santoro. Dr. Lena Santoro is a research professor in the Wheelock College of Education and Human Development at Boston University. She currently serves as Associate Director of Curriculum Design with the Wheelock Institute for the Science of Education, or WISE. She also serves as co-principal investigator of the Lead for Literacy Center and co-lead of the Instruction and Intervention strand for NCIL. In addition, Dr. Santoro works on projects related to the development of instructional interventions for students with literacy-related disabilities. Her research emphasizes literacy instruction for struggling readers and writers, with a special interest in supporting students' development of oral and written language skills, vocabulary, and comprehension. She is a former special education teacher. Lena?
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah. I just want to add a little bit more information about our webinar today, and then I'll introduce our speakers and frame the discussion. I want you to know that today's webinar is actually the second part of a 2-part conversation that we're focusing on multi-tiered systems of support in reading, or MTSS-R. ENSL hosted a part 1 Reading the Room discussion about multi-tiered systems of support in reading, where we had state leaders and reading researchers come together and share their perspectives on factors and characteristics which are consistently associated with strong implementation of MTSS-R. And our panelists also discussed how practitioners can implement high-quality MTSS-R to support all students' reading development. I know my ENSL colleagues will put that link to the first part of the Reading the Room webinar in the chat if they haven't done so already. So if you're interested, you can look for that link and watch that webinar at your leisure. So today, we'll continue our discussion about MTSS-R as defined as a school-wide framework that supports students who are struggling with reading through different levels of instruction and intervention intensity. In our current conversation, we'll focus on sustaining systems of support for reading. We'll have 3 leading experts with us in the field, and they'll share perspectives on factors and characteristics that are consistently associated with sustaining implementation of MTSS-R. Just so you have a sense of how our discussion will be organized, we'll begin by defining sustainability, and we'll discuss a plan for promoting sustainability in MTSS-R implementation. Our discussion will then shift to systems, the building a system of sustainability, and we'll think about considerations related to leadership and teaming, data use, some implementation tools. And then finally, we'll conclude by talking about barriers and obstacles to sustainability strategies for success and some lessons learned. And as Sarah said, throughout our conversation, you're welcome to pose questions in the chat box. I think my ENSO colleagues may try to answer some of your questions live during our discussion, and we'll also save some for our concluding Q&A with the panelists. So definitely leverage the chat box if you would love to comment or have questions about what we're discussing. Now it's my pleasure to introduce those who are joining me for the conversation today. First is Jason Borges. Jason is a literacy leader and specialist. His journey began in teaching over 20 years ago in alternative schools in Massachusetts for students with disabilities. He served in the Special Education Office in the New York Department of Education as Senior Director of Intensive Interventions and Director of Academic Intervention Services in the Office of Curriculum, Instruction, and Professional Learning. Jason sees literacy as a foundation for educational justice. He is committed to continue serving New York City Department of Education schools as Executive Director of New York City Public Schools Literacy Collaborative in developing literacy environments where all students learn skills that will help them engage with and adapt to changing media contexts and to use knowledge towards a more just world. Yeah, welcome, Jason. Dr. Nathan Clemens is a professor in Department of Special Education at the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Clemens studies reading difficulties in children and youth, and particularly word reading difficulties for students in the early grades, including dyslexia, and reading comprehension difficulties for students in later grades. His work is aimed at improving reading interventions, helping teachers make better use of assessment data to guide their instruction, and system-level intervention and assessment efforts. Yeah, welcome, Nathan.
Thanks very much. Good to be here.
Great. And now, Melissa Collier-Meek. Mel Collier-Meek is an associate professor of school psychology at Teachers College, Columbia University, where she conducts applied school-based implementation research with specialties in intervention fidelity and teacher consultation and coaching. She is presently co-principal investigator of an Institute of Education Sciences grant to evaluate support for elementary teachers' implementation of function-based interventions. Dr. Collier-Meek shares school-based implementation resources as co-director of the Sustain Collaborative. She received her PhD from University of Connecticut in 2013. Yeah, it's great to have you all here and to have our discussion focused on sustainability. As I shared, I think we're going to begin with some level setting and grounding our discussion on what sustainability means and how it's defined. In Century and Levy's work, they've defined sustainability as the ability of a program to operate on its core beliefs and values. So really thinking about reading culture from our perspective related to MTSS-R, and then using that to guide essential and inevitable program adaptations over time. So we're looking at a responsive system to help maintain and improve outcomes. So layering onto that, the National Implementation Research Network, we refer to it as NERN, defines sustainability as both an outcome and a process. So two perspectives. So I just would love to hear each of you provide your definition of sustainability, and or any variables or critical features that you think we should really put forward as we frame our conversation today. So the essential ingredients. So maybe Mel, I'll start with you first. Yeah, what is sustainability?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me on to talk about this. When I think about sustainability, I go back to implementation science and the EPIS framework, which is an overarching framework that walks through exploration, preparation, implementation, and then sustainment. And how they articulate sustainment is that it is when a practice or a framework is ingrained in the organization, when it's stabled and monitored, and there's ongoing quality improvement. So I think that that really captures a broad brush of what sustainment can look like in school settings when we think about MTSS-R. And I agree with the NERN folks that it is both that outcome and process. We're never done. And so those things definitely interact.
Yeah, thank you, Mel. Yeah, Jason, I saw you nodding your head, so maybe I'll have you step in next.
Well, it's funny that Melissa mentioned the EPIS framework, because when we worked here on looking at tier 3 when I was in the special education office. And I just also want to preface by saying sorry for all those titles and such here in the Department of Education. They're long and long-winded. But yeah, with the EPIS framework, what was interesting about that, we started to engage in an implementation of tier 3 across about 20 schools over about a 3-year period. And then somebody enlightened us with the EPIS framework, and we were able to gauge that and to think and actually look at how do you get to sustainability, right? Like looking at schools that were a little bit ahead than others. But just to echo what Melissa said, it's, when it's part of the school's culture, like this is what we do now, and that it is adapted over time, right? Like after, it's become part of the school's culture. So I would say that sustainability, yes, it's a outcome or a process and an outcome. It's just not an outcome. And I think you've got to start ahead of time as you're exploring and preparing with a new construct, that you have to keep both those things in mind.
Yeah, perfect. And I love our emphasis on that reading culture and really rallying emphasis and focus on that at a school and district level for sure. Yeah, Nathan, add more to the conversation and your definition of sustainability.
Sure. I think your definition is very good. I don't know if I'd have anything else to add to the definition itself, but I think you mentioned critical variables and things to consider in sustainability, and particularly sustaining MTSS-R or MTSS in general. And in the past couple years, I really keep going back to the need for simplicity, around the need for streamlining of understanding that there are essential features, perhaps non-negotiables in terms of the elements of what makes MTSS what makes the system its system, but then also thinking about, okay, well, what do we need? What is most important for our current context? What is the most essential element that is key to this? And so I think from a sustainability standpoint, both from adoption and sustainability, thinking about simpler systems, about maintaining the spirit and the essential elements, but also losing some of the things that aren't perhaps needed. And so that simplicity, and perhaps we can get into more later, but that's something I think a lot about is the need for simplicity and simpler systems.
Yeah, we'll hold on to that for sure, because I think that's so critical. And we can work towards defining what some of those pillars might be in those elements. I think that's really important framing, Nathan. as we get our discussion started. You know, another thing I think about within this context of defining sustainability, or the essential ingredients, if you will, is as you all know, our field talks quite a bit about evidence-based practices, and the science of reading is very prominent terminology these days. Where does that fit in to sustainability? So from an evidence-based practice perspective, how would you link those things to sustainability? And any of you can jump in and respond to that.
Oh, I'll go first.
Thank you.
I think evidence-based practice, I think, would be contributing certainly to sustainability insofar as that evidence-based practice is also demonstrating improvement among the population in which you're implementing. An evidence-based practice obviously is giving you the best shot at improvement. And there would be nothing worse for sustainability than something that's perceived as ineffective. And so I think evidence-based practice coming in gives you at least the basis, the foundation for something that, you know, has the odds of working, of having an effect, of benefiting the student population and population in question. Implementation obviously is a big part of it, but I'd say that would be the first step.
Yeah,
Sustainability.
I think yes. What I want to highlight too from what you said is that just that notion of the effectiveness. We know something works, so paying attention to that in the model up front when we're thinking about sustainability. Yeah. Now, anything else to add?
Yeah, I mean, I would highlight that when we were when Dr. Clemens earlier was talking about sustainability, the importance or simplicity, like evidence-based practices are more likely to have that durable, effective impact. So we're unlikely to completely change them. They're unlikely or less likely to be fads. So when we think about preparing our educators for the fundamentals and training and coaching them to be prepared for practices, evidence-based practice makes sense from a resource, you know, coaching perspective as well. And I really like NERN has an active implementation framework, which describes evidence-based practice with effective implementation and enabling context as the way to think about implementation and change at a school level. So evidence-based practice are absolutely like a critical component of making that happen for student outcomes, but also for the adults in the building.
Yeah, no, it's just so central. It's so central in making the whole mechanism and system work. Yeah, great. Jason, I'm going to come to you with this next question because I heard a little bit of it in your answer when you first responded. But I think part of defining and thinking about sustainability is considering when to start to think about it. And so when do we start to think about sustainability? Is it something as part of our upfront thinking? Is it a prerequisite to building our system? From your work as a school leader, where does that come in? When do you start to think about? When do you start to think about sustainability?
I think early on in some of the work that we've done is that we were not keeping the end in mind so much. We were kind of all exploring and then thinking through like how to prepare before we implement. But now I know from a central perspective right now, as well as when we're working with particularly some school leaders, is that we keep the sustainability always in mind, right? So like, what is it that's going to need to happen across the systems, from district into schools, and then also that kind of micro system within a school is imperative, right? And so we try to keep that end in mind all the time, but it's multifaceted. Is what we've learned. It's not just going directly to teacher, implementing, say, an evidence-based practice, getting them the tools and the training to do that, but keeping the end in mind, it's pretty complex when we're thinking about working with district leaders and principals in terms of thinking about all those systems within the context, and to ensure that those systems are bought in, particularly from a leadership perspective, right? And to best be able to support those practices.
Yeah. So much in your response. I think about highlighting the micro and the macro of systems level implementation. And I think your answer is capturing what we talked about as we started, which is that it is something to think about with the end in mind. So the outcome, but also the important work of viewing it as a process. So that ongoing work is so intringent. And I think, yes, it's really, we look at the outcome in mind up front. And so, yeah, that makes sense. Nathan and Mel, please add on. When, from your perspective or your work, when do you think about sustainability? At what point in the process?
I mean, I think wherever you are in the process, start thinking about it now.
Mhm.
If you are in an exploration space, I think it's a wonderful time to be thinking about it. You're going to let fewer new ideas in, and you're going to make sure the ideas that you do let in, or the practices and programs that you do let in, are very needed and aligned, and that you have sufficient support to make sure that they can be sustained. I think another important piece that is within this is thinking about planful de-implementation, and how that is an ongoing process that takes time. Unlearning behaviors or systems takes time. And so thinking about planning for sustainability throughout wherever you are, and using the opportunity that you have, depending on where you are, to really think planfully about what you're bringing in or what you're taking out, and what needs to be done at the systems level to support the educators that you're working with.
Yeah, nice. Yeah. And I think that it's not just learning, it's unlearning the right. Yeah. So key. Nathan, anything else about when to think about this? Is it a prerequisite? It's a beginning. I love now it's ongoing all the time. Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think, from the start, it's constant. It has to be constantly on the agenda. I think as you think about sustainability, as many of us here on the call and in the audience have probably experienced that everything seems to be going along great until you have a leader leave, right? Until you have a superintendent or you have a principal depart. And then, as we've probably all experienced, everything just falls apart or discontinues. And so I think as you think about planning from the beginning, planning for sustainability, having those kinds of plans, what will happen if leadership changes? Do we have enough knowledge, understanding amongst the individuals implementing, amongst other levels of administration that can sustain, that believe in the process and believe in what is happening with this particular model, those kinds of things to navigate those practical issues around leadership changing would be one example.
Yeah, and you set us up for my next question really well, and that is sort of shifting into a conversation now about the elements of a sustaining a system. So what are those elements? And I think those elements, to address your point about potential departures of staff or the things that can fall and crack. I think let's now define what those elements might be that also might address and buffer and make our system more robust, so that it can withstand some of the things that might happen related to staff departures and other obstacles. So as we shift into this building a system of sustainability, Nathan, I would love to come back to you, because I want to talk more about your framing of a simplistic viewpoint. What are those essential elements of a system, and what do we need to pay attention to as we build for sustainability?
Yeah. Well, I think first off, though, the phrase need for simpler systems, I don't want to take credit for, because that was in a paper that Lynn and Doug Fuchs wrote several years ago on the need for simpler systems, about looking at evidence and data that were available at that time, indicating that schools were having a very difficult time implementing MTSS well and sustaining it. And they had a couple of sources of data from there. And so they pitched the case that we need to think more simply about it. And I think, as you consider MTSS, you can think about core features around universal screening, around a tiered system of intervention intensification, around insistence on evidence-based core instruction, on ongoing progress monitoring for students who are receiving more intensive levels of support, and also the teaming processes that happen within grade and across grade levels that enable effective decisions around programs that are implemented, around placement of students into tiered groups and supplemental supports, and interpreting the data as they come in. And I might be missing a couple, but you can think about sort of MTSS as that collection of elements. Do all of those have to be implemented? I think that is something that can be scrutinized. I think many times we make the case for MTSS and it's delivered in terms of professional development and other types of training models, and we say, this is what you need to do. And schools say, okay, we'll try it. And they implement, they take all these elements and change a lot of things. And as we know, change is very difficult. Anytime it's more complex and extensive, the more difficult it is to get up and running. And then obviously that poses issues for sustainability. The question I would want to ask is, and think about, is that can we look at a more nuanced perspective of implementation, thinking about a particular school district or a particular school? What key elements are they struggling with? Where are the issues? Where do the data indicate that they have challenges from a reading achievement standpoint? Can we think about a more focused, streamlined model that will address maybe one thing? Can we change one thing in the next coming year? Can we improve the way in which word reading is taught in early grade levels? Can we kind of think about that in terms of a system change process? And then with success, with momentum, can we build on from there?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Nathan. I think, yeah, very powerful. I remember early in my career, we talked about a school as a host environment, right? With this unique set of variables, a unique context. And then I think applying what you just outlined, I think it really does distill what sustainability is about and illustrates your example how it can be accessible. Where I think at times sustainability, when we think about it, can be quite overwhelming. So yeah, thank you for setting it up like from that perspective and referencing the Fuchs within that context too. Yeah, Mel, I'll come to you, and then Jason. First, Mel, I want to talk to you a little bit about, and it relates to what you referenced with the NERN model, where we're seeing a system of continuous improvement, really driving, basically layering on what Nathan is saying. So we have these essential elements related to core instruction and data, PD, professional development, coaching, leadership, families, but then at work to drive that model, it's continuous improvement process. And I think some of those listening might reference that or know of it as Plan, Do, Study, Act, or Plan, Do, Check, Act. And so talking a little bit about that intersection here when we're thinking about building a system of sustainability. And then Jason, next, sort of continuing to unpack that, but also from your leadership perspective, roles. I'd love to have you add in the importance of leadership and teaming to that. So maybe Mel, you can start with a little bit more about continuous improvement.
Absolutely. I mean, we in schools are getting really comfortable talking to our students about a growth mindset and making goals and setting goals and working towards those goals. And we see that as an effective practice, even in reading. And we need to bring that to our own behavior. I think as we understand behavior change is hard, It does not happen overnight, particularly in the context of de-implementation. We really need to be thoughtful and planful about how we roll out implementation and sustainability efforts. I think that I really appreciate Nate's point earlier about being thoughtful about what you bring in. And that's where like a brief needs assessment or resource mapping can be so useful. How can we better allocate resources, or how can, as folks are planning for their budgets for next year, where are the line items that support the practices, not just the practices, but the ongoing coaching, and the, data preparation. So depending on what the needs assessment or resource mapping reveals about what's needed in that context, it can be things like, building team capacity to analyze data and provide teachers with feedback on instruction, or what does best practice in coaching look like, or do teachers need to build skills about reviewing formative data and shifting their instruction? Like, depending on our school context, we'll highlight and target different things, but having a plan moves us in a more directive place than us just trying to get MTSS better, right? So using the guidance that we provide to students about having a goal, having a clear plan for their work, it's also useful for our work, and is something that we can adopt and shift and build a plan at the district or school level.
Yeah, Jason, I'm coming to, I just want, this is, I think what you're saying is so important, and I just want to highlight it. The evaluation planning around action planning, and truly coming up with a document, not just a conceptual conversation, but truly having a roadmap that you can rely on, which goes, I think, to the point that we've been talking about. How do you front load planning in a way that would address any issues or departures, and so having those actual documents, I think, is part of it. And maybe we come to that when we talk about resources too. But thank you. Jason, on my way to you, more on the continuous improvement process and how that might be working in your work, but also I think really important in this conversation is leadership and teaming, and thinking about all those, how we're really bringing in on and staff and building a coalition around this work.
Yeah, I'll highlight actually some visits I've been going to up in the Bronx in a district there where the superintendent has made this work a priority, and what she's done to galvanize the district around the work, and this started about 4 years ago actually, is she established a shared vision with principals around like making literacy the imperative for the district, and putting in certain structures within schools. So the first, I know one of the things that she said was, I mean, all principals know time, talent, and treasure, right? So like, look at your time, look at your human resources, and then also thinking about your funding. And she supported the principals with looking at those things, initially in terms of making initial changes. So making shifts in the curriculum, and then looking at the interventions that were taking place. And I would say 4 years into the work, just last week, we visited a couple schools in that district, and the systems within the schools were starting to talk to each other, right? There was more within tier 1, there was, small group targeted instruction happening, and then interventionists working, particularly in grades 2 and up, where they're starting to talk to each other, meaning like, let's look at, how to provide access to, texts that are being used within the core curriculum and things like that. So I probed her and I was like, what are the systems that you have in place? And, it was all about regular PLCs, professional learning community meetings with principals, regular professional learning community meetings that principals are leveraging within the schools themselves. And then I asked, well, what do some of those look like? And she said, well, when we started just shifting with curriculum, is that each teacher across the grade would take on a module to be able to design, right? And then the next time it was another teacher's turn and so forth. And so it started to build that collective efficacy. And then the interventionists were receiving training where they were coming together to look at progress monitoring data on the students that they were serving. So that like those structures, took time, but those are the things that were, built in terms of, systems and processes within the schools that I visited within that district. But those are, as a leader, those are the things that you have to do to get things going.
Yeah, thank you. I think your example makes it really real, and that we can really see it and visualize what that is like. One of the things you mentioned in your response, I want to grab onto and then ask Nell and Nathan to respond, is the data piece. I don't think I can leave this part of our conversation without talking about how important data is. And I want to make the note, and you all can respond and add more to this. Student data is essential, but it's also implementation data that's important as well. Implementation and fidelity. And so Mel, I know you do a lot of work in this space. So I'll start a little bit there with you, and then maybe Nathan, you can pick up and add more. So Mel, just a little bit more about how important the data piece is that Jason mentioned.
Oh, it's absolutely essential. I mean, this is how we make decisions about what we need to do differently, both the student outcome and the implementation data. And I think that something we struggle with in school is when we think and we hear that we need data, we think about what's the additional source that we can, or what measure do I need to adopt? And again, when we're coming from that simplicity lens, what do we already know? And what do we have available? And how can we use that information to shift understand our practices and what's actually happening, and then shift our practices to be responsive to the students that we're serving, right? And that is why sustainability is such an important frame, in that you'll never be done. Your students will shift, their needs will shift. It's this ongoing process of data review to inform our kind of our system level practices that is so key. So most people really struggle with looking at implementation data. Don't be afraid to start small with kind of self-report or observations or checklists from teachers, or having some sense of what's going well and what folks are struggling to bring in will allow you to analyze your data with more precision and make better decisions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Nathan.
Yeah, I think building off some of these things, I think as schools think about their data collection, I want to make sure that they're not getting too focused in thinking about the data for one specific purpose. For example, universal screening data is a key element of MTSS. It's used to identify, obviously, students who are in need of supplemental support. But it can also be used and should be used by schools to evaluate their system needs. What do the data say, not just from an individual student identification standpoint, but where do we see challenges? Where do we see our instruction being insufficient potentially? Where do we see students having the greatest areas of difficulty based on the reading data we've collected? I think thinking about how data can be used in multiple ways is one key thing to think about. I think also recognizing when you don't need additional data, when you've already collected data that for example, I'm a big advocate, and there's evidence to support this, that schools typically don't need to add universal screening beyond third grade because there's so much existing data on students from high stakes achievement tests and so on. You have enough to tell you where you need to allocate more support and who needs additional intervention. And so recognizing when you don't need additional data, you don't need elements to bring in, and you have the data that will work for the needs that you have. And I think then from a fidelity, from an implementation standpoint, I think collecting those data to ensure that the the elements that you want to see implemented are present, but also, again, taking a more informed approach and saying, we don't need high fidelity on this particular aspect just because it's on a form, right? This particular aspect we're doing for a specific purpose. We're doing it because we have a need for it in our school or in our district, not simply because it's on a fidelity form. So again, I think it's more of that, taking that more informed, nuanced perspective on the type of data that are being collected.
No, I thank you. Thank you both for your responses with that. And Jason, just an opportunity if you wanted to say more about data, student data or implementation data fidelity, I can come back and circle to you.
Sure. I just, what Nathaniel was sharing was spot on. What I see is too much data being used. And I think to Nathaniel's point, like looking particularly at screener data, to kind of get a sense of what are what's the health of core instruction, for instance. How effective is your core instruction? Do you have, if it's an upside down triangle, it's going to be revealed in your screening data, things like that. And we're in our third year of universal screening here in New York City, and I think by the third year, and in most districts right now, they've come to that understanding of looking at it kind of in both ways of like, systems level, or when a teacher has to think about like unique needs of students and that might need supplemental support. But right now, like my fear is always is that either misconceptions around the use of these types of measures, and then number two, having access to too much data and kind of getting lost in it.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, so it's really calibrating that use. Perfect. No, thank you. So I think we've really summarized, some critical elements for our sustaining and building that sustainable system for MTSS-R. We really look at some of the data supports to know that our work is working. Let's shift a little bit then to our final part of our discussion. I'm hoping we can talk a little bit about strategies from success and lessons learned from your work personally. I know we have addressed barriers already, I think. We talked about, I think one of the largest really is staff turnover. It is instability in a system. It is unknowns like the COVID pandemic. There are all these things that can create really imbalance in a particular system. But part of your response to strategies for success can be how you address some of the barriers. So folding your answer sort of together to think about addressing barriers, but also what have you seen really work well personally? And so maybe Mel, I'll start with you.
Sure. I think first, this is hard. This is really, really hard. And I think that when school leaders demonstrate that implementation is not a checklist and systems change is not a checklist, they build an implementation culture and climate that facilitates learning, engagement, and this like continuous improvement that we've been talking about. I think when I've seen strong programs, I think that the administrator does a nice job of not bringing in every little thing. So, right, like being a little bit of a gatekeeper to new initiatives, being thoughtful about what's being added on, making sure they're really aligned with goals, making sure everyone's on board with those broad goals. And then they spend a lot of time with building staff competency. So really, again, maybe even less focused on what's the student practice, but really focused in on what supports do the educators need to bring this to students on a consistent basis. So doing fewer things and then putting the support in to helping them do it well. I think that those pieces really guide school leaders and school teams to have a robust process that can be responsive to the challenges along the way of implementation.
Perfect. And so Jason, over to you related to strategies for success and lessons learned, sort of wrapped up together.
What we found successful is, coming from a central administration level is working with the districts to get to know the schools, getting to know where are they within this work, and then what do they need, just starting at a technical level of resources. That can be anything from training to making sure ensuring that they have access to things like intervention programs, for example, and starting small within the schools. So what we found successful was doing work with intensive intervention is starting with case studies and being able to coach along, with data meetings, and then building out from there. We found to be successful. And I'll also add that the technical support and also it's actually more adaptive support as well, to be able to work with school leaders while support's being provided for teachers as they're just implementing.
Love it. Thank you. I love it. To Nathan also, success strategies, lessons learned.
Yeah, I think it just goes back to some of the things you mentioned early on. Lena, the ability to adapt, the permission to adapt. And I think that's true of many types of interventions, is that when implementers are able to adjust it, to adapt it to their context, their environment, or their culture, then it's more likely to stay. I think in the experiences I've had in terms of sustainability, that's been something that has been mentioned, is that ability to adapt, to make it our own. But also the common denominator amongst those long-term implementers has been stable leadership, has been a principle that's been there since the beginning. And not that it can't sustain once leadership leaves, but I think schools really have to problem solve and anticipate what will happen if we do have leadership change, and ensuring that things continue. And yeah.
Yeah, no, perfect. I think, you said so much that I connect to, Nathan, in our work at ENSL. One is leadership for sure, that we know leaders are pivotal in terms of this work. And so ENSL really looks at leaders as part of that comprehensive literacy community that we want to support and build. The other is just that, and we come back to where we started, which I kind of like that as a conclusion, is how important a reading culture is, not just in the way we define sustainability, but taking that at a school level, district level. That's serious work to really honor that host environment or reading culture and sort of build the work around that. And I think you've all addressed that. And that was in our definition of sustainability when we started. So ready just to make sure that we have time for some Q&A with our participants. But as we transition to that, I want you, if you have any recommended resources, to share those. I'll start and then just quickly check in with you if you want to highlight anything. I think this has been shared in the chat. I saw it come through. ENSL has something called an MTSS-R implementation guide. Check that out. It's comprehensive, and it provides resources and support for critical elements of MTSS-R, basically aligned with what Nathan mentioned today. And it takes you through the continuous improvement process of evaluating, planning, implementing, and it has great materials to use. You can actually collectively use this as a school community or PLC to help support your implementation of MTSS-R. The tools involved in this MTSS-R implementation guide are tools that can help support sustainability. From soup to nuts, really, down to agendas, sample agendas that you can use to hold and host meetings, which I think at a very, we call micro level, and a micro level of implementation is really important. Mel, I saw you did insert something into the chat. Any further notes on the NERN resources or any other resources you'd like to share?
Yeah, I highlighted a few different things. The EPIS framework website is really accessible and really walks through the different phases. I found the NERN, their active implementation hub is really useful. They have a great literacy example in their video that is very illuminative. And then it may be in poor taste, but I shared my own resources that might be useful to some folks. But I would encourage folks to just think about implementation broadly and then pull it into MTSS-R as it makes sense for them.
Yeah, thanks, Mel. Perfect. Yeah, Nathan or Jason, anything else to add related to resource sharing? No. Yeah, great. Thank you. Good.
So,
Well,
Lena,
yes,
I'm
Sarah,
sorry to
thank you.
interject. So we did have a question come in related to time and scheduling. So I think we have enough time to address that. And this is a concern about not having enough time to provide Tier 2 instruction to supplement Tier 1. And what could schools or districts do related to scheduling and time when the literacy block may not be long enough to provide that type of support?
Yeah, Mel, do you want to start with that?
Yes, I actually have a resource that I will pop in the chat when I find it about scheduling. I mean, I think that this is a great thing to think about at this time of year for next year. I would also suggest looking at, there are example schedules from different secondary schools and middle schools and high schools who have figured out different creative solutions, whether that's like block lunch or, using a kind of common period in creative ways, or using a longer period to have core instruction and supplemental instruction. So I will find that resource and pop it in the chat, but I think you're not alone in that time part being a challenge. So I would look to schools at other levels who have problem solved this and, see what suggestions you can adopt.
Well, I encourage others to put any questions into the chat. It looks like we don't have any more at this time. But if you do think of any, please do drop them in. If we're not able to answer them today, we will certainly make sure that you get a response to your question. And with that, I want to thank our panelists for sharing their perspectives and experience, and our attendees for participating today. We hope you join us for future Reading the Room events. You will receive a recording of today's event, and it will be posted on the NCIL website. A brief feedback form for this event will automatically launch in your web browser when you leave the webinar, and we kindly ask for you to complete it then. To stay abreast of the latest NCIL news and information, please follow us on Facebook at Improving Literacy or on X at NCI Literacy, and sign up for our newsletter at improvingliteracy.org. Thank you again for joining us for the 7th Reading the Room event in our series and your interest in promoting evidence-based literacy practices. Have a great rest of your week. Thank you, everyone.